Hello everyone and welcome back to Scary Stories channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Puppeteer. It was late autumn when Emily and her fiancé, Peter, decided to visit the old mansion on the edge of town. They had heard whispers about the place for years, always spoken in hushed tones by the locals. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, and many believed it to be cursed. No one dared go near it, but Emily and Peter, always up for an adventure, thought it would be the perfect place for a quiet weekend getaway. The mansion stood at the top of a hill, its dark silhouette looming against the gray sky. As they approached, the wind howled through the trees, sending a chill down their spines. The mansion seemed to sigh with age, its windows like hollow eyes watching them as they walked up the cracked stone path. "It's even creepier than I imagined," Peter muttered, his voice almost a whisper. Emily laughed, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her chest. "It's just an old house, Peter. A little dust and cobwebs won't kill us." The doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a grand hallway filled with dust and forgotten memories. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they explored the mansion, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house was vast, with large rooms and high ceilings, but it was clear that time had not been kind to it. The wallpaper peeled away in long strips, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time. As they wandered deeper into the house, they stumbled upon a room at the back of the mansion, hidden behind a set of heavy curtains. Inside was a small stage, almost like a miniature theater, with rows of wooden benches scattered about. At the center of the stage stood an old wooden puppet theater, its frame covered in dust. The puppets, dozens of them, sat in small chairs, lifeless and motionless, their glass eyes staring vacantly ahead. "This is strange," Emily said, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. She approached the puppet theater, her fingers brushing over the intricate carvings on the frame. The puppets seemed to be of different sizes and shapes, some human-like, others monstrous, with exaggerated features and twisted expressions. Peter, always the skeptic, laughed nervously. "It's just an old puppet show. Nothing to be afraid of." But as he spoke, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker. Emily felt a coldness seep into her bones, and she shivered. She turned to Peter, but he was no longer looking at her. He was staring at the back of the room, where a dark figure stood in the shadows. "Peter?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Peter didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the figure, his face pale and frozen in terror. Emily's heart raced as she followed his gaze. The figure in the shadows was tall, thin, and draped in a dark cloak, its face obscured by a hood. For a moment it seemed to simply stand there, motionless, watching them. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It stepped forward into the dim light, revealing a face that was anything but human. Its features were twisted and grotesque like a puppet's face, but with a mouth that opened unnaturally wide. It smiled at them, a smile that was too wide, too sharp, a grin that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of its face. Emily screamed, but Peter didn't move. He was still staring at the figure, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It was as if he were frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The figure raised its hand, and the puppets on the stage began to move. At first it was subtle, just a twitch of their wooden fingers. a slight shift of their heads. But then, as if the figure was controlling them with invisible strings, the puppets began to stand one by one. They twisted and jerked with unnatural movements, their limbs creaking as they came to life. Their eyes, once dull and lifeless, now glowed with an eerie light, and their smiles became wicked, malicious. The figure, still hidden in its dark cloak, moved its hands as if directing the puppets. They began to walk toward Emily and Peter, their wooden feet scraping against the floor, their eyes fixed on the terrified couple. "Peter!" Emily screamed, but her voice was lost in the growing sound of creaking wood and soft whispers. The puppets moved faster now, their steps quickening, their hands reaching out toward them. Suddenly the figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of dry wood scraping against stone. "Once you enter my theater," it said, "you can never leave." Emily grabbed Peter's arm, shaking him, but he remained frozen. His eyes locked on the puppets as they approached. The figure raised its hand and the puppets stopped, their eyes still staring at the couple. "You are mine now," the figure said, its smile widening. "You will dance, you will perform, and you will never leave this place." The puppets began to move again, closing in on Emily and Peter, their hands reaching for them, their smiles growing wider with each step. In a desperate panic, Emily yanked Peter away from the figure, dragging him toward the door. But the puppets were faster. They swarmed around them, their cold wooden hands grabbing at their limbs, pulling them back toward the stage. Emily fought, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. The puppets were too strong, their grip unyielding. The figure in the cloak stepped closer, its twisted grin never fading. "Welcome to the show," it whispered, as the puppets closed in on them, their wooden fingers digging into their skin. Emily and Peter realized with horror that they were no longer in control of their own bodies. Their limbs moved against their will, jerking and twitching as if they were puppets on strings. The figure's laughter echoed in the room, hollow and cruel, and as the couple was forced to take their places on the stage, their eyes wide with terror, the figure raised its hand once more, and the puppets began to perform. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness consumed her was the twisted grin of the figure, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. The next morning, the mansion was silent. No one knew what had happened to Emily and Peter. The neighbors said they had heard strange sounds coming from the house the night before, screams, whispers, and the eerie creaking of wood. But when the local authorities investigated, they found the mansion empty, as though no one had ever been there. The puppet theater, however, was left behind, and if you look closely, you might see the faintest movement from the puppets, just a twitch of a finger, or a flicker of an eye, waiting for their next performance. Story 3. The Eyes in the Mirror. It was a rainy evening when Lily and her husband, Ben, moved into their new home. The house was an old Victorian-style property, set on a quiet street on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, but they managed to snag it for a great price. The couple was excited about starting fresh in the large, charming house, despite the rumors they had heard from the neighbors. People in town spoke of strange happenings in the area. But Lily and Ben were practical. They dismissed the gossip about the house being cursed, chalking it up to small-town superstition. The house was big, beautiful, and most importantly, it was theirs. The house had a certain eerie quality to it, though. The wood floors creaked with every step. The walls groaned when the wind blew, and the air always felt a bit cooler than it should. Still, Lily loved it. It was a perfect project for them. There were rooms to decorate, history to uncover, and plenty of space to grow into. The first few nights were peaceful enough. They unpacked their things, adjusted to the new space, and even started to make it feel like home. But as the days passed, they began to notice strange things. Small things at first. A light bulb that would flicker on its own. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. And the feeling of being watched. Especially when they were in the bathrooms. It was in the master bathroom that the real horror began. One evening, while Lily was brushing her hair in front of the large, ornate mirror in the bathroom, she felt it, an intense cold sensation behind her. She turned, expecting to see Ben standing there, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection seemed wrong. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow behind her, something dark and indistinct. But when she looked around, there was nothing there. Shaking it off as her imagination, she finished brushing her hair and left the bathroom. But the feeling lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding something. Something she wasn't supposed to know. The next day, Ben was out at work, and Lily found herself cleaning the house, trying to make it feel more like home. She was tidying up the bathroom when she noticed the mirror again. This time she felt an overwhelming urge to take a closer look. The mirror was large and framed in dark wood, with intricate carvings along the edges. It seemed to have a life of its own, almost as if it were watching her. Lily stared at her reflection, her breath fogging up the glass. She was about to turn away when she saw it. Two small, glowing dots in the corner of the mirror. They were faint at first, but they grew brighter, sharper, almost like eyes staring back at her. Lily blinked and rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, the eyes were still there, locked onto hers. The reflection of herself in the mirror was no longer the same. Her face was distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable, a grotesque version of herself. Then she heard the whispering. It was soft at first, a low murmur coming from the depths of the mirror. It sounded like a voice calling her name, but distorted, as though it were coming from far away. Lily. Lily froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers, but not her voice. It was hollow, broken, as though it came from someone trapped behind the mirror. The eyes in the reflection grew larger, more intense, and Lily could feel her heart racing. She reached out toward the mirror, her fingers trembling, but before she could touch it, the reflection of herself in the glass smiled. It was a twisted, malevolent grin, a smile that didn't belong to her. It was as if the reflection was mocking her, reveling in her fear. In a panic, Lily backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The eyes followed her movement, never leaving her. She turned and ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew she couldn't go back in there. Not yet, not until she figured out what was going on. That night, Ben returned home, and Lily tried to tell him what had happened, but he didn't believe her. He thought it was just stress from the move, or maybe a trick of the light. He suggested they take a break and relax. but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. Lily couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she walked past the bathroom, she felt the pull of the mirror, as though it was calling to her, begging her to return. But she didn't dare go near it again. Ben, sensing that something was off, decided to investigate the history of the house. What he found disturbed him. The house had once belonged to a wealthy family, one with a tragic past. The family had a daughter, Eleanor, who had been known for her beauty and grace. But Eleanor had been deeply troubled. She had fallen in love with a man who had betrayed her, and in a fit of rage, she had taken her own life in front of the very mirror that now hung in their bathroom. The story went that Eleanor's spirit had never left the house. Her grief and anger had bound her to the mirror, and over the years, her spirit had become twisted, malevolent. The mirror was said to be a portal, one that allowed her to reach out to those who dared to look too long. Ben was horrified. He tried to warn Lily, but it was too late. The next night, Lily found herself drawn to the bathroom once again. She couldn't fight it. Something in the mirror was calling to her, and despite the terror gnawing at her, she had to look. When she stepped in front of the mirror, her reflection was waiting. The eyes were there, glowing with an unnatural light, and the twisted version of herself smiled at her once more. This time the voice was louder, clearer. "Lily, come closer." Lily's body moved against her will. She reached out toward the mirror, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. Suddenly, her reflection reached out too, its hand pressing against the other side of the mirror, as if it were trying to pull her through. In that moment, Lily screamed, but the reflection did not. It grinned, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. And then the glass began to crack. The last thing Lily saw before she was consumed by the mirror was her reflection, its eyes glowing, pulling her in, and the sound of Eleanor's voice whispering in the darkness. The next morning, Ben found the bathroom door locked. He knocked and called out to Lily, but there was no answer. The house was eerily silent. When he forced the door open, he found the bathroom empty. There was no sign of Lily except for the cracked mirror, its surface now smooth again. But there was something different. In the reflection, there were two sets of eyes. Story 3. The House on Hawthorne Hill. James and Clara had always dreamed of owning a house in the country. They were both tired of the noise and chaos of the city and wanted a peaceful retreat, somewhere far away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. So when they came across an old, sprawling estate on Hawthorne Hill, they couldn't resist. It was perfect. The house, which had been abandoned for decades, was a grand Victorian mansion, perched on a hill that overlooked miles of dense forest. It was the kind of house they had always imagined owning. Creaky floors, large windows, and a wraparound porch. The price was unbelievably low, far below what one would expect for such a large property. The realtor mentioned that the house had a strange history, but James and Clara dismissed it. After all, it was an old house. It was bound to have a few legends attached to it. The first night they spent in the house was magical. The air was crisp and fresh, and the silence was profound. The only sounds were the wind, rustling through the trees, and the occasional creak of the house settling. They spent the evening unpacking and exploring the sprawling rooms. The house was large, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and old wallpaper peeling away in places. But there was something charming about it, even in its dilapidated state. They had just finished setting up the living room. when Clara noticed a door at the far end of the hall. It was an old wooden door, different from the others. It was slightly ajar, and from the faint smell of must and decay that wafted from the crack, it seemed to lead to a part of the house that hadn't been touched in years. "Let's see what's in there," James suggested with a grin. Eager to explore their new home, Clara hesitated but then smiled. Why not? They pushed open the door, and what they found was a narrow staircase leading down into a dark, cold basement. The steps creaked under their weight, and the air grew colder with each step they took. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rows upon rows of old, dusty boxes and forgotten belongings. It looked like a storage area, but there was something off about it, something that made Clara's skin prickle with unease. "Let's get out of here," Clara said, her voice shaking. James, however, was already moving toward a large, dusty mirror at the far end of the room. It was an antique, framed in dark wood, and it seemed to draw him in as though it were calling to him. "James, don't," Clara said, her voice rising in fear. But James was already standing in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The dim light flickered, casting shadows across the room. But then James noticed something strange. His reflection was not quite right. It was subtle at first. His movements were slightly delayed, as if the reflection wasn't quite in sync with his actions. But then, to his horror, he saw something else in the reflection. A shadow moving behind him. James spun around, but there was nothing there, only the cold, empty basement. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was watching them. Clara grabbed his arm, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We need to leave, James, now!" But it was too late. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them in the basement. The temperature dropped rapidly and the air felt suffocating. Clara screamed, but her voice echoed back at her, distorted. Suddenly the mirror began to vibrate. The reflection of James and Clara started to shift, becoming distorted and warped. The figure in the mirror, the one that wasn't James, began to move, and its eyes locked onto Clara. "Clara," a voice whispered from the mirror, a cold, raspy voice that sent shivers down her spine. She backed away, but the figure in the mirror slowly reached out, its hand pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. The reflection of James in the mirror grinned, an unnatural, twisted grin that wasn't his own. Clara screamed and grabbed James's arm. "We have to get out of here." Together they rushed toward the stairs, but the door remained locked. Panicked, James tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering voice grew louder, and the figure in the mirror began to laugh, a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the room. Then the figure stepped out of the mirror. Clara's heart stopped. Standing before them was a tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by shadows. The skin on its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. It reached out toward them, its fingers long and bony. James and Clara screamed in unison, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there staring at them. Then it spoke in that same raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come here." James grabbed Clara's hand and yanked her toward the stairs. The figure didn't stop them, but its presence hung in the air, suffocating and oppressive. They finally made it to the top of the stairs, but when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself were holding them captive. Story 4. The Silent Caller. Mia had never been one to believe in the supernatural. She was practical, logical, and preferred her world grounded in reality. So when she moved into the old apartment on Elm Street, she didn't give much thought to the strange rumors she heard from the neighbors. The apartment had been empty for months, but it was affordable, and Mia was eager to start fresh after a tough breakup. The building itself was worn, the paint chipped and faded, but she loved the tall windows that let in the natural light and the view of the tree-lined street outside. On her first night there, Mia felt a strange calmness settle over her. She unpacked her things and made herself comfortable in the cozy space. Nothing seemed amiss until the phone call. It was late, just after midnight. Mia was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone, when the old landline in the kitchen rang. She frowned. She hadn't even noticed when the phone had been installed, but she hadn't bothered to question it. She got up and walked over to the kitchen, picking up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, her voice tired. There was no response. Mia waited a moment, thinking it was just a wrong number, but then she heard it. A soft, slow breathing. "Hello?" she asked again, a little uneasy now. The breathing continued, but there was no voice, no words, just the sound of someone or something breathing heavily into the phone. "Who is this?" Mia asked, her heart starting to race. The breath came faster now, more frantic, as if something was struggling to speak. But still, no words came, just that suffocating, eerie breathing. Mia slammed the phone down, her mind racing. It had to be a prank, she thought. Probably some kids messing with her. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that settled over her, but she couldn't. The next night, at the same time, the phone rang again. Mia hesitated before answering, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Again, there was no response, only that same heavy, labored breathing. Mia's heart pounded as the sound seemed to echo through her mind, growing louder and more desperate. "Who is this?" Mia shouted into the phone. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered on the other end. "I'm in the walls." Mia froze. The words hung in the air, filling the room with a chilling presence. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Her hands were shaking as she slowly hung up the phone. The eerie stillness of the apartment weighed heavily on her. She stared at the receiver, the words "I'm in the walls" echoing in her mind. The next few days, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The apartment felt different, darker, more oppressive. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though she were being watched. At night, the phone would ring again, and every time it would be the same. The heavy breathing, the whisper, "I'm in the walls." Mia tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just some sick joke. She even thought about moving out, but she didn't want to let fear control her. She changed the phone number, thinking that would solve the problem. But the calls continued, the same voice, the same whisper. "I'm in the walls." But then one night, the whisper changed. "I'm behind the walls." Mia's heart raced. She couldn't take it anymore. That night, she decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and started searching the apartment, looking for any clue that might explain the strange calls. She started with the walls. She tapped on each one, listening for any hollow spots. The old apartment creaked and groaned with age, but Mia was persistent. She moved to the bedroom wall, tapping gently with her knuckles. It sounded different. She pressed her ear to the wall, holding her breath. For a few seconds, there was nothing. But then she heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. Her blood ran cold. Mia stepped back from the wall, her mind racing. She couldn't believe it, but the more she thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. The strange calls, The unsettling feeling in the apartment. It all made sense now. The voice wasn't just a prank. Someone or something had been hiding inside the walls the whole time. With trembling hands, Mia grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and began to unscrew the paneling on the bedroom wall. The sound of the screws coming loose filled the silent apartment. As she pulled the panel away, a cold, stale air rushed out from the wall. And there, in the darkness behind the wall, she saw something move. A pair of eyes. The eyes were wide open, staring at her from the narrow space between the studs. Mia screamed, dropping the screwdriver, and stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. But the eyes didn't move. They just stared at her, unmoving, unblinking. Then, as if the wall itself were alive, the eyes blinked and the whisper came again. "I'm right here." Mia ran from the apartment, not looking back until she was safely outside. She called the police, but when they arrived, the wall was empty. There was no sign of anyone or anything behind it. The apartment was sealed, and Mia was never allowed back inside. The building was eventually abandoned, the tenants moving away after strange occurrences began to happen. The phone line was cut, but the calls still came, every night at midnight, to anyone who dared stay in the apartment, and sometimes late at night. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear the faint whisper on the other end of the line, echoing through the silence. "I'm in the walls." Story 5. The Mirror in the Basement. Claire had always been a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of the supernatural tales that her friends and family liked to tell around campfires. It was just stories, nothing more. That's what she told herself when she moved into the old house on Ashford Street. The house had been empty for years, its previous owners having mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The neighbors were wary of the house, but Claire didn't understand why. It was a large, beautiful home with old-world charm, and it was within her budget, practically a steal. She knew she could restore it to its former glory with a little work. The first few days were spent cleaning, unpacking, and making the house her own. But it was on the third day that Claire began to notice something strange. It started with the basement. The house had an old, dusty basement, one she hadn't visited yet. She had planned to store her things down there, but there was something about it that made her uneasy. The door was locked when she first arrived, and she hadn't bothered to check it out until now. One afternoon, feeling curious, Claire decided to take a look. She grabbed the old key she found in a drawer and unlocked the door. The basement was dark, but Claire wasn't afraid. She flicked on the light and descended the stairs, the creaking wood underfoot echoing through the house. The room was cold and musty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. But what caught Claire's attention wasn't the furniture. It was the large, ornate mirror that stood against the far wall. It was a beautiful mirror, old-fashioned with a gold frame, but it was the only thing in the basement that seemed to be in pristine condition. Every other piece of furniture looked worn or damaged, but the mirror was perfectly clean and polished. Claire stepped closer, admiring its reflection. But as she gazed into the glass, something felt off. The image in the mirror didn't quite match the room she stood in. It took Claire a moment to realize what was wrong. There, in the reflection, standing behind her, was a shadow, a dark figure. Claire whipped around, heart pounding, but the basement was empty. There was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, her breath shallow. The shadow was still there, but now it was moving. Slowly it reached its hand toward her. Frozen in place, Claire could hardly breathe. She stepped back from the mirror, but the shadow inched closer, its hand now almost touching the glass. With a sudden rush of fear, Claire turned and fled from the basement. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her hands trembling. She leaned against the door, trying to calm her racing heart. That night, Claire tried to brush it off. She told herself it was just her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that mirror. The next day, when Claire returned to the basement, she cautiously approached the mirror again. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive. She stared into the glass, willing herself to ignore the chilling sensation creeping up her spine. But the shadow was there again, now clearer than before. It was a tall, thin figure, almost human in shape. But its features were blurry and undefined. Claire gasped as the shadow reached out again, this time with both hands pressing against the glass. The reflection seemed to shimmer, distorting, as if it were no longer connected to the physical world. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could turn and run, the mirror seemed to pulsate, and the shadow stepped forward, as if it were coming out of the glass. Claire screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a piece of furniture. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind her once again. She didn't know what to do. She felt like she was losing her mind. Every time she went near the mirror, the shadow seemed to get closer, more insistent. That night, Claire tried to sleep, but the sound of scratching from the basement kept her awake. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing minute. Scratching, tapping, as if something was trying to escape. Then the voice came. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. A whisper, low and raspy, coming from the basement. "Let me out." Claire tried to ignore it, but the voice grew louder, more urgent. She couldn't take it anymore. In the middle of the night, she grabbed a flashlight and went back down to the basement. Her hands were shaking, her heart hammering in her chest, but she had to know. When she opened the basement door, the air hit her like a cold wave. The mirror was standing there, gleaming in the dim light, and the shadow was there once again. But this time, the figure wasn't just reaching out, it was pressing against the glass, its face inches from the surface, its eyes wide and hollow. Claire screamed and tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The shadow's hands pressed against the glass harder, and the mirror began to vibrate. The voice, now louder and more frantic, echoed through the basement.
"Let me out!"
"Let me out." Claire backed away slowly, her flashlight flickering. And then, in a terrifying moment of clarity, she realized that the shadow wasn't just in the mirror. It was in the basement with her. The last thing Claire saw before the darkness swallowed her was the reflection in the mirror, a reflection that wasn't her own. The next day, the house was silent. The neighbors noticed that Claire hadn't been outside in a while, and when they went to check on her, they found the door to the basement wide open, the mirror staring out from the shadows. Claire was never seen again, but the mirror remains in the basement, waiting for the next person to come too close, to peer into its depths, and to see the shadow reach out for them. Story 6. The Uninvited Guest. It was a quiet Friday evening when Jake and his girlfriend, Sophie, decided to have a relaxing night in. They had just moved into a small but charming apartment in the city, a perfect space for the two of them to start fresh. The apartment was on the top floor of an old building, and the view from their window overlooked a bustling street below. Sophie had been eager to unpack and make the place feel like home, and Jake was happy to help, though he couldn't shake a strange feeling he had whenever he walked through the hallways of the building. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, just an unsettling sensation, like being watched. But that night it was all about the cozy atmosphere. They ordered takeout, set up the living room with blankets and pillows, and watched a movie together. The apartment, for all its quirks, felt safe and warm. At about 11 p.m., after finishing their meal and lounging on the couch, Sophie stood up to go to the kitchen. She stretched, then froze when she noticed something in the hallway. There was a faint flickering light coming from the door to the apartment next door. "That's weird," Sophie said, pointing it out to Jake. "I thought I saw that light off earlier." Jake looked over at the door next to theirs. It was slightly ajar, the light from inside spilling out into the hallway. "Weird," he muttered. "Maybe they left it on by mistake." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "But no one's supposed to be living there, right?" Jake wasn't sure. He hadn't seen anyone move in next door when they first arrived. But it was possible someone had recently moved in and hadn't finished unpacking. They decided to let it go, but the strange feeling lingered. A few minutes later, Sophie went to the bathroom, leaving Jake alone in the living room. He continued to watch the movie, trying to shake the unease that had been growing inside him. Suddenly he heard a noise, a soft scrape from the hallway. It was faint, but it was there. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned off the TV and stood up, walking cautiously toward the hallway. The flickering light from next door was still visible, but something felt off. He approached the door slowly, his hand resting on the doorknob. He hesitated. For some reason, he felt compelled to open it to see who was inside. Sophie walked over to the door, pushing it open fully. The hallway light flickered briefly before stabilizing. There was nothing inside the apartment. It was empty, completely, eerily empty. Jake let out a sigh of relief, but Sophie's expression darkened. "Okay, that's strange," she muttered. "Let's just lock the door and forget it." They did, and for the rest of the night, they tried to shake the feeling of unease. But as they settled back on the couch, the scraping noise returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Jake glanced nervously at the door to the neighbor's apartment. The scratching sound continued, almost rhythmic now, like something or someone was trying to get out. Sophie stood up abruptly, her face pale. "I'm going to call the landlord," she said, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, feeling a growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Sophie took out her phone, but as she scrolled through her contacts, the scratching grew louder still. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. Everything went quiet. Sophie froze, looking around the apartment. "What the hell was that?" Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Jake's blood ran cold. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow and deliberate, as though whoever was knocking was waiting for them to answer. Sophie and Jake exchanged a worried glance. Jake walked cautiously to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the doorknob, he hesitated. "We're not expecting anyone, right?" Sophie whispered from behind him. "No," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. He opened the door slowly. There was no one on the other side, but something was different. The light from the hallway illuminated the empty space, and there, lying on the welcome mat, was a small, weathered key. The key was old, its edges worn smooth by time. There was no note or explanation, just the key. "What the hell?" Sophie said, taking a step back. Jake bent down to pick it up, and as his fingers touched the cool metal, he felt a sharp chill run through his body. The door to the neighbor's apartment was now wide open again, though neither of them had touched it. Jake and Sophie exchanged a terrified glance. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew they needed to leave. The key felt heavy in Jake's hand, and he looked at Sophie, who was already backing away. But just before they could turn to leave, a voice came from the open doorway. A soft, raspy whisper that sent chills down their spines. "You shouldn't have come in." Before they could react, the door slammed shut, and the key in Jake's hand started to burn, searing hot against his skin. He dropped it with a shout, and it clattered to the floor. rolling toward the darkened corner of the apartment. Sophie screamed. The walls seemed to close in, and the whole apartment was filled with the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. It smiled. Story 7. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a crisp evening in late autumn when Sarah and her friend, Alex, decided to take a late night drive down a quiet country road. They had been on their way home from a small gathering, and the roads were almost entirely deserted, save for the occasional passing car. The sun had long since set, and the air had a chill to it that signaled the coming of winter. Sarah, driving, hummed along to the soft music playing in the background, her mind at ease. Alex, who had been quiet for most of the ride, stared out the window at the passing trees. The road they were on was winding, surrounded by dense woods and the occasional farmhouse. They were miles from the nearest town, and the dim glow of the headlights barely pierced the darkness ahead. As they rounded a bend in the road, Sarah's headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, she thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the light. But as they got closer, she saw it was a young woman, her thumb outstretched in a gesture that could only mean one thing: a hitchhiker. "Should we stop?" Sarah asked, glancing over at Alex. "I don't know," Alex replied, his voice hesitant. "It's pretty late and this place is weirdly remote." But Sarah was already slowing the car down. Something about the figure intrigued her. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, dressed in a long coat, her hair flowing behind her in the wind. As they came to a stop beside her, the woman smiled softly and opened the door. "Thank you for stopping," she said in a soft, almost musical voice. "I'm trying to get to the next town. It's really cold out here." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Of course, hop in." The woman slid into the back seat and Sarah resumed driving. The car's interior was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the woman adjusting herself in the back seat. After a few minutes of driving in silence, Sarah decided to break the ice. "So where are you headed?" The woman's voice came from the back, calm and distant. "Oh, just to the next town over. It's not far. I'll be fine once I get there." Alex glanced in the rearview mirror, but all he saw was the woman's reflection in the back seat. She was gazing out the window, her expression unreadable. "That's good," Alex said, though he still felt uneasy. "It's pretty late to be hitchhiking, don't you think?" The woman didn't respond immediately. When she did speak, her voice was soft, almost as if she were lost in thought. "I've been walking for hours. I never thought I'd end up out here. But I guess fate has a funny way of making us meet people, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. They continued driving, the road stretching endlessly ahead of them. The forest to their left seemed to close in, dark and silent, and the only sound was the soft hum of the car. Then, as they passed a particularly dense patch of woods, the woman in the back seat spoke again. "I think I'm close now. You can let me out here, thank you." Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. The back seat was empty. "What the hell?" Alex blurted out, his voice rising. Sarah slammed on the brakes, causing the car to screech to a halt. She whipped her head around, her heart pounding, but there was no sign of the woman. Not a single trace. I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "She was just there, right? She was talking to us." Alex looked outside, scanning the dark stretch of road. There was no one in sight. "I didn't see her get out," he said, his voice unnerved. "We didn't stop long enough for her to vanish." Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed in the cup holder. She picked it up, her hands shaking as she saw the text message. It was from her mother. "Sarah, are you okay? Please don't drive down that road." There's an old ghost story about it. They say no one who stopped for the hitchhiker has ever made it to the next town. Sarah's blood ran cold. What does that mean? Alex asked, his voice quivering. Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a picture. She opened it and her breath caught in her throat. The picture was blurry, but unmistakably. It was a photo of her and Alex in the car, taken from the back seat. But the woman, she wasn't in the car at that moment. The message that followed was chilling. I'll be waiting for you at the next town. Panic set in. Sarah slammed the car into reverse and sped back down the road, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She drove for what felt like hours, but the road never seemed to end. The trees blurred past, and the darkness outside swallowed them whole. Eventually, they came to a fork in the road that wasn't on the map. Sarah slowed the car to a stop, trying to orient herself. That's impossible, Alex murmured. How can this road keep changing? We're going in circles. As Sarah turned to look at Alex, she saw something in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing there, right behind the car, her face pale and expressionless. Before Sarah could react, the woman spoke softly. You were supposed to stop. The headlights flickered, and the car was suddenly surrounded by dense fog. The woman's face grew closer in the mirror, her smile widening. I told you I'd be waiting. That was the last thing Sarah and Alex heard before the car went silent. The engine cut out and everything around them went dark. The next morning, the car was found abandoned at the side of the road. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of Sarah or Alex, only a single, eerie message carved into the dirt beside the vehicle. Don't pick up strangers. Story 8. The shadows beneath the lake. The town of Ashford was quiet, nestled deep in the mountains and surrounded by dense forests. Its most notable feature was Blackwater Lake, a vast, eerily still body of water that stretched for miles. The lake was both a blessing and a curse, a source of livelihood for fishermen, but also the subject of countless dark tales. Locals whispered about strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena near its shores. Many avoided it after dark, but young people, always eager to test the bounds of fear, often dared one another to visit. One summer evening, a group of 5 friends, Emma, Jake, Nora, Liam, and Clara, decided to camp by the lake. They had grown up hearing the stories, but dismissed them as superstition. Let's prove it's just a bunch of nonsense, Jake said as they pitched their tents near the water's edge. The sun set, casting fiery colors across the lake before fading into darkness. The group lit a fire and shared stories, their laughter cutting through the quiet night. Okay, Nora said, grinning. Who's brave enough to swim out to the dock? The dock was a rickety, abandoned structure about 50 yards from the shore. It was said to be cursed, a place where people had vanished without a trace. Easy, Jake said, stripping off his shirt. I'll do it. No way, Clara said, shaking her head. The water's freezing and it's pitch black. Jake shrugged. Scared? Before anyone could stop him, he waded into the water. The others watched as he swam, the beam of his flashlight bobbing on the surface. He reached the dock and climbed onto it, waving back at them. See? No ghosts here. Okay, now come back, Emma shouted. Jake turned to dive back into the water, but paused. He stared down at the dark surface, his body tense. What's wrong? Liam called out. Jake didn't respond. He knelt down, peering closer at the water. Then he stood abruptly, his flashlight dropping into the lake. Jake! Nora shouted, but he remained frozen, staring down. Suddenly, something surged out of the water, dark, shapeless, and impossibly fast. It wrapped around Jake's legs, pulling him under before he could even scream. The others rushed to the water's edge, shouting his name, but the lake was calm, its surface unbroken. Where is he? Clara cried, her voice trembling. We have to go in after him, Liam said, but Emma grabbed his arm. No, she said. Something's out there. We need help. Before they could decide what to do, the temperature dropped sharply. A thick mist rolled in, obscuring the lake. The fire sputtered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Let's get back to the car, Emma said, her voice shaking. They grabbed their flashlights and hurried along the path toward the parking lot. The mist seemed to thicken with every step, muffling their voices and making it hard to see. Stay close, Liam said, glancing back. But when he turned around, Clara was gone. Clara? Emma called, spinning around. There was no answer, only the sound of water dripping somewhere nearby. Keep moving, Liam said, panic rising in his voice. They stumbled through the fog, their breaths coming in gasps. The sound of footsteps echoed around them, but they couldn't tell if it was each other, or someone or something following them. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the mist, partially obscured. Clara? Nora called hesitantly. The figure didn't move. Emma shone her flashlight toward it, and they all froze. It wasn't Clara. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and glistening like it had just emerged from the water. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It took a step toward them. Run! Liam shouted. They sprinted down the path, the figure's footsteps echoing behind them. The mist seemed alive, twisting around them, pulling them off course. When they finally broke free of the fog, they were back at the lake. No, Emma whispered, realizing they had run in a circle. The lake was no longer still. The surface churned violently, as though something massive was moving beneath it. Shapes began to emerge, figures like the one they'd seen, rising from the water and staggering toward them. We have to get to the car, Liam shouted. They turned to run, but one of the figures grabbed Nora, pulling her into the lake. She screamed, her flashlight disappearing beneath the surface. Emma and Liam ran, not daring to look back. They finally reached the parking lot, but the car was gone. It was right here, Liam said, panic in his voice. The sound of footsteps made them turn around. The figures were approaching, their empty eyes fixed on them. We're trapped, Emma whispered. Liam grabbed her hand. We can't just stand here. Before they could move, the ground beneath them gave way. They fell into freezing water, the weight of the lake pulling them down. Emma struggled, her lungs burning, but the surface seemed impossibly far away. She saw the figures in the water, their hands reaching for her, their faces twisted in silent agony. Her vision blurred and everything went dark. The next morning, a fisherman found their campsite abandoned. The tents were torn, their belongings scattered. The lake was calm, as if nothing had happened. The town added their names to the long list of those who had vanished near Blackwater Lake. And at night, if you stand by the shore and listen closely, you can hear whispers coming from the water, calling you to join them. Story 9. The Silent Passenger. Martha was a long-haul truck driver, used to the solitude of the road. She'd been driving for nearly 15 years, crisscrossing the country, and found comfort in the hum of her engine and the vast empty highways. One night, she was hauling a load through the desert. It was a moonless night, and the road stretched endlessly in front of her, lit only by the dim glow of her headlights. She hadn't passed another car in hours, and the radio offered nothing but static. Martha reached for her thermos, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee. The road was monotonous, and she felt her eyelids grow heavy. She rolled down the window, letting the cool night air wake her up. That's when she saw him. A figure stood on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by her headlights. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that flapped in the wind. His face was pale, with dark sunken eyes that seemed to follow her as she drove past. Martha frowned. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers, but something about him unsettled her. She told herself it was just her imagination and kept driving. A few miles later, she glanced in her rearview mirror and froze. The man was standing in the middle of the road, far behind her, but still visible in the faint glow of her taillights. It was impossible. She'd been driving at 60 miles per hour. There was no way he could have kept up. Her hands tightened on the wheel. "Just keep going," she muttered to herself. The road twisted and turned, leading her through a desolate stretch of desert. She didn't see the man again, but the feeling of unease stayed with her. Hours passed, and Martha finally began to relax. The radio crackled to life, a faint country song breaking through the static. She smiled, glad for the company of music, and turned the volume up. But then, in the middle of the song, the signal cut out. A low, distorted voice replaced the music. "You can't run." Martha's heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned the radio off, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath, trying to shake the fear that clung to her. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated something in the road. It was a dark shape lying motionless across the asphalt. She slowed down, squinting to make it out. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. Its body was twisted unnaturally, and its eyes were wide open, reflecting the light in a way that made her stomach turn. Martha swerved around it, her pulse racing. She glanced in the mirror again, expecting to see the deer behind her. Instead, she saw the man. He was sitting in the passenger seat. Martha screamed and slammed on the brakes. Her truck skidded to a stop, and she twisted around to look at the seat. It was empty. Her breathing was ragged as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. She told herself it was a trick of the light, her tired mind playing tricks on her. But when she turned back to the road, he was standing there directly in front of her truck. His face was inches from the windshield, his dark eyes staring directly into hers. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Martha threw the truck into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed away. When she looked forward again, he was gone. She didn't stop driving until she reached a small diner on the edge of the desert. The parking lot was empty except for a single car. She parked her truck and stumbled inside, her hands still shaking. The diner was quiet, with only one other customer sitting at the counter. He was an older man with a weathered face and a trucker's cap. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said, his voice rough. Martha sat down, her mouth dry. I don't know what I saw." The man nodded knowingly. "You were on Route 89, weren't you?" Her eyes widened. "How did you know?" He sighed. "You're not the first. People see things on that road. Always at night, always the same figure. Some say it's the ghost of a man who died out there trying to hitch a ride. Others say it's something older, something that's been out there long before the road was built." Martha stared at him, her heart pounding. "Does it ever stop?" The man looked at her, his expression grim. "Not until it gets what it wants." Martha left the diner shortly after, too shaken to eat. She climbed back into her truck, her eyes scanning the empty parking lot. As she started the engine, she felt it again, that suffocating sense of being watched. She looked in the rearview mirror. The man was sitting in the back seat, smiling.